Hey, friendo, Steve here.
And Larson.
And welcome back to Going In Raw, the only pro wrestling podcast you need to be listening to. It's back, Dark Side of the Ring. This is always a lot of fun to do these reviews. Today, obviously, is going to be a bit heavier than some of these. But, I mean, God, we didn't even do the one with the Jake Roberts, the Smith family.
That's right.
Because that one was just heavy across the board. We sort of explained ourselves back then. But this one, The Plane Ride from Hell. Episode kicking off the second half of season 3 was interesting to say the least, in that when the plane ride from hell is commonly discussed, it is discussed in a way that has never really had the proper weight behind what was going on the plane, and it hasn't had the singular voice to frame the conversation about the plane ride from hell. And this episode absolutely had that with Heidi Doyle, one of the attendants on.
Yes, because I think previously we've gotten one perspective on the plane ride from hell, and that was the wrestlers on the plane. I believe this is the first time we've heard from one of the flight attendants or one of the crew members of said plane.
It's also the first time we've heard this story play out in a way that was given the proper respect towards the gravity of the situation. David Bixenspan tweeted out a compilation. There's 2 different times this incident was discussed prior to this that are sort of the more popular ways, and it was like they were both animated. One was, I think, in the WWE animated show where they sort of recollect incidents from the past. Like, God, what was the show where...
I know what you're talking about, but I don't remember what it was called. Yeah.
I forget what it was.
Storytime.
Storytime, yeah. Storytime was one of them. And then, God, I so apologize. But it was too...
Well, in the Ric Flair documentary, they told a story. I don't know if it was this incident or a similar one that was, I believe, animated in that.
Okay, that could be.
I thought so. Unless I'm thinking of the story type one. That's entirely possible.
Let's see here. Give me 1 second here, and I'll find it. But yeah, like the whole theme of boys will be boys, and what that really means is sort of obviously the prevailing one here. And up until, obviously with the Me Too movement, with the speaking out movement, things have changed. Accountability is a real thing now. And the gravity of what goes on, the dynamics, the power dynamics at play is obviously something that is on people's minds these days, and holding people accountable for being shitty. And that's what this episode, really reflected. And I honestly, I can't wait. I really hope we're able to get Jason and Evan back on the show, maybe at the tail end of the season, so that we can really get in depth with some of this stuff. Because I'm wondering at what point along the way, when this episode was brought up as an idea to do, was it ever like, hey, this is going to be a funny episode to produce or a fun episode to produce? And where did it turn into, no, this was fucked up? Because when you see one of the animated bits with Flair, he's narrating it, and I think it was in story time. And like in his words, the flight attendants, who are all drawn as very buxom, they're obviously in cartoons, but very buxom and very willing participants in this whole thing. And he even mentions one of them was backed up against the captain's cabin and he wouldn't let her in. And then he says something like, oh, and you know what they wanted. And it's like, oh, this is so goofy and fun. And it's like, no, it's not. It's horrifying for these people. And so I wonder if there was any moment early on when they realized this is damning to Ric Flair. And then what were they thinking when Tommy Dreamer started talking and the stuff that was jaw-dropping coming out of his mouth? did they realize in the moment this guy just totally hung himself?
I would.
Those are questions that I would love to ask.
yeah, totally. So let me go back. So I thought I remembered something in the Ric Flair 30 for 30, the ESPN documentary. There was an animated bit about him exposing himself, and it was an incident prior, because Sting was on this plane, so I'd imagine it's in his WCW days. And this is a quote. This is from a Deadspin article where Sting in this says, I mean, I've never seen a guy with his pants pulled down more than Ric Flair. Mm-hmm. And this morning, after, of course, Dark Side had aired last night, my apologies for not remembering or being able to reference who posted this. Posted a little snippet of a Shane Douglas interview. And he's talking about how embarrassed he was by Ric Flair seemingly exposing himself in public places. Yeah. So this is not an isolated incident.
No. So
this is a pattern of behavior.
I finally found out there was a ton of Bixenspan tweets a lot. But obviously this Dark Side episode has blown something open, which will probably have wide-ranging implications. It's funny, I was watching I had both our friendos from Church of Joshi. Kayla I was watching her Twitch stream. She was watching Salute Underground, and Alex was doing a watch along with this. And I only caught the beginning of it, but I can only imagine. I know Alex had kept it up on her channel. She's doing watch along with Darkside, and I can only imagine. I haven't gone back to watch it yet, but I know she had a tirade at the end about Tommy Dreamer. Yeah. And I can only imagine her jaw dropping live on air, watching this thing. Because
I totally did watching it on my couch.
I had only seen like a clip last night when he had mentioned the crap about, people are offended, but at my hair, and equating that with people being offended over sex. I'm like, what? But when he then said, so that's the only thing I saw last night. And then this morning when I watched it, I was sort of prepared for that, but I wasn't prepared for him saying, well, she took the money. Maybe she should have gone to the cops if this was so important. I gasped. I was like, fuck you. That's insane that today you would still, after everything that's come out, that's still a philosophy somebody would have. After everything we know about trauma and victim blaming and this and that he would have that line of thought and think that it was okay to say that.
Yeah, there was several times when Tommy Dreamer was talking, I was like, oh my gosh. Did you really just say that? So
it was 30 for 30 with the ESPN and then story time. Yeah, so it was both.
Yeah, the one on the plane with Sting is again, this Deadspin article has a write up about it. So I remember that watching the 30 for 30. I'm like, this. I mean, he's exposing himself in public. Maybe animated form is not the best way to present the story,
Yeah, so he actually says and this is right, but the way Flair describes it is actually similar to the way, but in a joking way, that Heidi describes it in the show, sort of backing down a flight attendant, but in a fun way. But apparently he said, Bixenspan says, I don't believe that either clip is supposed to be referencing the plane ride from hell. Which makes it even worse, which means that this was something that he would regularly do. And yeah, like you said, there was the Sting. Yeah, that's right. This was just something he would do.
Yeah. Is this something he did? Yeah. And that's what that was referenced in Dark Side too, is when Rick wanted to pop his fellow wrestlers.
Yeah.
He would wear his robe and nothing underneath.
Yeah.
And
it's like, it's one thing if you're in a locker room full of dudes with the same mentality. Like, I still think that wouldn't fly today regardless, especially today. I mean, that's one thing. One of the takeaways with JR at the end saying, the younger generation probably looks back on this and sees what not to do. And that's why you got a bunch of people with heads on screwed on properly these days. I mean, it'd be shocking to think that Seth Rollins or Roman Reigns or Xavier Woods or any number of the people would be doing that kind of stuff these days. It'd be shocking if that was the case. I mean, evidently with the speaking out stuff, there was a certain element that was still at play.
Yes.
But in terms of like the upper echelon of WWE or WWE in general, seems like they would probably have less of a But yeah, I don't know. I was completely blown away by something that, you know, when we first heard this was going to be explored, I did not think that it was going to be like this.
Again,
as Denise Salcedo on Twitter said, this is one of the, she used the word, most incriminating episodes of Dark Side.
It really was.
Yeah.
I mean, because you know, granted, I haven't done, you know, tons of research on the plane ride from hell. You hear stories, and you hear about a pretty extreme level of debauchery happening on this plane in terms of drinking, in terms of drugs. I don't remember reading anything about people slipping halcyons in people's drinks.
Yeah.
You know, the perhaps the most famous stories were Lesnar and Mr. Perfect wrestling, and then X-Pac chopping off Michael Hayes' ponytail.
Yeah.
Those are the two stories that I feel like really got the most traction. But yeah, this goes way deeper, way more in depth, and as you mentioned, way more incriminating.
Yeah. And getting Heidi Doyle on camera, and I mean, God bless her. Obviously, recounting this stuff is traumatic in itself, but like her philosophy at the end is, if I have to say this, if I have to have this horrible conversation 25 times to help one person, then it's worth it. And it's like, you know, thank God there are people like that out in the world, willing to put themselves out there publicly. The
amount of strength and bravery it takes to do that is pretty incredible.
Exactly.
It's pretty incredible.
Yeah. So we can go through some of the beats here and some of the more jaw-dropping, mind-boggling.
Before we get to that, I want to get to one point about the Flair stuff and how the two stories that have been related in terms of him exposing himself have been animated and definitely told through the prism of, I'm sure, how Ric Flair chooses to remember them.
Sure, yeah.
You know, relatively lighthearted, ha, what a funny joke this is. To expose yourself in public. Like, I don't know why those incidents are presented in such a lighthearted manner when there's nothing lighthearted about it.
I mean, because accountability, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's just, it's, you know, with, that is a question that I think can be asked of people in Hollywood, you know, with the Me Too stuff, people in the corporate world, you know. I mean, I know just anecdotally, well, I'm not going to speak on that because it's personal stuff and I don't want to get my sister in trouble. But the disparity between power roles in gender is something that goes back, obviously, historically speaking, you know, hundreds of thousands, you know, thousands of years, hundreds of years, decades, et cetera, et cetera. That is a question where, unfortunately, it has taken time for work to be done and brave people to step forward and say, enough of this shit. Like, this stuff isn't good. It takes, you know, a random stand-up set by Hannibal Buress to call out Bill Cosby. And then he gets accountability, and then some of the dominoes start to fall. And I feel like the world of pro wrestling, it takes one Heidi Doyle to properly put into context, hey, this isn't funny. Let's think, let's revisit this. Let's think about this. There's victims here. There are people who now think about this, and it's doubly heartbreaking. This lady just had a kid at the time that all she wanted to do was get back and be a mom and make $1 to raise her kid. And now she's got this in her head for the rest of her life. She has Scott Hall being a piece of shit for the rest of her life. She has Ric Flair grabbing her hand and putting it on his genitals for the rest of her life. You know, I mean, it takes one brave person, unfortunately, having to relive this shit for any change to happen. And she put it so, I think, unintentionally eloquently when she said, you know, what you want and what should happen is change. But what you get is money. Because that's how corporations work, and they have NDAs. And they've got this, that, and the other, your settlement money. Well, we're not going to change anything, but we'll give you a bunch of money.
Yeah. While we're on that topic, let's talk. So they explained in this episode that it was a private jet that WWF at the time had chartered to take him to Europe. They used it for the tour and returned back to the States. And so while the entire plane was well appointed, I think they said usually a plane of this size has like 192 seats. This one had about 50. And it was from a service that it was their business to charter flights for professional sports teams and professional sports organizations. Yeah, Sport Jet, I think it was called, something like that. And so even with that, though, there was a partition that there was the front of the cabin, which is usually on a normal passenger plane, first class, and then what would be economy was still appointed with first class amenities, but there was still that partition. So of course in the first class area was Vince, Linda, JR. I believe Terry Runnels says she was up there. So during the entire flight, they're stuck on the tarmac for 7 hours before they even take off, and it's probably a 6-7 hour flight across the Atlantic.
Yeah. For
the entire 14 hours this stuff's going on, Vince is sitting there and not once apparently says anything.
Wasn't that the weirdest punchline? Like the entire time, you don't even think about. I wasn't even thinking about that. And I think probably along the way, having heard about this before, I'd probably known that he was on the flight. But when you're watching this, it's not in your mind that Vince is present, because and one of the more shocking moments was twofold. When at first Jim Ross, head of talent relations, says, I don't know whose job it is to keep these people in line, to keep these adults in line, but it ain't mine. And then 20 minutes later, it was my job to keep these people in line. Well, which is it, Jim? Which is it? Are you supposed to be the head of talent relations and keep them in line or not? Or did you just not want to deal with it because you're used to boys being boys?
So there's one of the reenactments, I believe, is Vince telling JR to go, I think it was, or someone telling JR to go address the Mr. Perfect Lesnar.
I think it was Vince. It was supposed to be Vince, yeah.
I think it was Vince. And, granted, who knows what JR's actual reaction, but in the reenactment, you see the JR actor, heavy sigh.
Yeah.
Now, I wasn't on the plane. I don't know what JR's attitude was about that. It was a telling little bit of direction, though, in the reenactment, especially in light of some of his statements about, hey, it's not my role to have these wrestlers behave like adults.
Yeah.
And then not a few minutes later, I have to go and tell these wrestlers to behave like adults, essentially,
Yeah. No, I mean, dude, if there were actual cameras there, who knows? Who knows? But it's like, dude, we've talked about before, one of the main reasons why seemingly WCW is such a shit show is because there was no accountability. There was no singular person. That person for many years was Eric Bischoff. And what happened when he fired one of the wrestlers? He got put in a closet by Hall and Nash, apparently, allegedly. I don't even know if that was, I still don't remember if that was actually like confirmed or not or what. But there seemed to be there at WCW no amount of accountability.
Yeah.
People just do what they wanted to do. With WWE, there was always Vince. There, he would fine Steve Austin $650,000 for walking out on a Raw match because they wanted him to lose to Brock Lesnar. He would fire or suspend Ultimate Warrior for trying to hold him. There was accountability with Vince, and that scene that you're talking about, I didn't when it was playing out. For whatever reason, my mind was like, oh, that was later on in The Office when Vince was telling JR. But no, that was on the plane. Vince was there. That was shocking to me.
And JR explained it this way. Is like, Vince is the one that makes decisions, but then he tells people to go and execute his decisions.
If this needed to stop, Vince would have just walked back there, and in one word, it would have stopped. It would have been done.
You'd like to think so. You like to think if he went back there and just told them all to sit down and shut up and go to sleep, you would think, given, hey, we've raised the ire of the boss now, we better shut up, sit down, and close our eyes. You would think, but
There's like 2 instances I can think of popularly in WWE history when people defied Vince. And one was the Montreal Screwjob. We saw how that worked. And the other was the Ultimate Warrior. And we saw how that worked. You know, I'm sure there's been other instances, and maybe but those famously. But Vince has the last say. Vince has the last word. He always wins. And the idea like that he couldn't have just gone back there and said, hey, who here wants to be fired? No. Okay, then sit down and stop this. Yeah, no, that was, I mean, you could tell this is one of the things where I just wonder if when the camera started rolling, if Jim Ross didn't stop and think to himself, maybe I shouldn't be on this one, because he doesn't come off as particular. I mean, at least he's being as far as we can tell, as honest as possible, And it's obvious that he understands this is a terrible look for just everything involved,
Yeah, like one of the first things he says, if I never had to talk about the plane ride from hell ever again, I'd be perfectly happy,
Yeah. And I wonder if this is just one of those things where, I mean, obviously he understands the weight of it, and maybe it's one of those things where, hey, I just need to get this off my chest and let things play out the way they do. Tommy Dreamer almost gleefully getting out the rope, forming a noose, putting it around his own neck is shocking to watch. And of course, there are real world accountability for this, consequences for this. Yeah. It's been announced that he's been suspended indefinitely by Impact Wrestling. I mean,
because of his statements on the show. Yeah,
this is less than 24 hours. Since this aired, and it's not. I don't know how he can go into the Knockouts locker room or a Knockouts creative meeting and look anybody in the eye, and and talk to them, because defending this behavior or equating outrage over his dumb haircut to outrage over sexual assault is the height of obliviousness.
Yeah,
to say the least.
Yes.
So it'll be interesting if we get like a notes app. The dude, I mean, honestly, the dude just needs to listen and do a little bit of soul searching, because clearly he's got some backward ass views on this type of stuff.
Yes.
And it's a shame because, who doesn't up until this point is like Tommy, seems like a cool guy, but then he says shit like this and it's like, oh, wow. Yeah. You need to,
need to do some soul searching here, Tommy.
Yeah. Maybe take a class or something, whatever you do these days to figure that stuff out. Read a book. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it's not to say there wasn't some amount of, absurdly humorous things going on. I mean, the whole bit about just JBL trying to catch some sleep and having been busted open, and so he's got some fresh stitches. And then Michael Hayes, I must have missed it. Was there a motivation for Michael Hayes?
No, he got a halcyon dropped in his drink.
Hayes did.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I can't remember who mentioned this, but they said like he was not acting himself, so he just went up to JBL and just hit him.
So he just there was no like actual real world like logic behind it. He was just like at JBL.
Not that was provided by the show. No.
Yeah. I mean, given what we've heard in the past about JBL, you got to think there was something triggering that. Well, I mean, it's nuts. Drugs can do that kind of shit. But like, the various things we've heard, we've often said here on the show, JBL is a fascinating individual, seemingly
he's a complex individual. That's for sure.
A highly intelligent human being who can play the stock market like a whiz and builds like houses for children in need or families in need.
He seems to do a lot of really good charitable, philanthropic work.
But then at the same time, when you look back, a lot of the story, him and Joey Styles was forced to punch him.
This seems to be a horrible bully.
Right. It's a complicated individual to say the least. So Michael Hayes going up and just like whacking him. And then after that, JBL knocks him out. and then X-Pac, who got tired of apparently being buried in creative.
Yeah, they didn't mention that on the show. They cut in the little soundbite from him, I think from a shoot interview or something, because we had watched, I believe, that him talking about that at one point when we were still in the office. And I don't remember his motivation exactly behind it. The way they kind of put it in the show was essentially that X-Pac wanted to be liked. That's essentially how they put it.
I thought that sound clip, and it was a bit muddied, but I thought that sound clip was something like he'd always bury me in creative meetings.
No, could be.
That's what I thought I heard. If I was wrong about that, please somebody correct me in the comments. But yeah, and JR said something like he wanted to be a main event guy.
Yeah.
And so he chops his little ponytail off.
And then JR says he held it up like he had just won a championship.
Everybody cheered him for that, which is, again, a violation, but at the same time, you could see the humor in that, you could see the humor in that. It's probably an awful thing, but it's a dude's ponytail. And for the reasons of he wanted to be a main event guy, a little surreal, bizarre. Kurt Hennig, getting some shaving cream and just slapping the top of Brock Lesnar's head with it, which, my God, I mean, they accurately describe Brock Lesnar as a bear of a man in this, and for anybody to go up to him and do that is like, oh my, why would you ever do that?
I know,
Kurt Hennig.
I
know.
But
Kurt Hennig wasn't a small guy either, and they're both, I think, from Minnesota.
Yeah.
So maybe there was something there, and then they just start going at it, and they get near the emergency exit. And,
and it was interesting how Heidi Doyle put it, that it was less an issue of them like busting through the emergency exit, I guess, because they're in the air. You have to push that door outward.
It's incredibly difficult to do.
It's by the way she put it, it'd be easier for them to break the fuselage.
Yeah.
The wall of the plane.
Yeah.
Because I can't remember who it was. The Kyoto saying that, like, when they were wrestling and hitting the wall of the plane, you could feel the plane, moving accordingly.
Yeah.
Which is scary.
That's terrifying.
But if they had busted a hole in the fuselage, then you're depressurizing the cabin, then you can make an emergency landing, but you're over the Atlantic, so that's a water landing, and
yeah. Then you lost like the entire like main event scene. Yeah, there was kind of like buried within this too when they're talking about Brock is him exposing himself to Terry Runnels and the tragic way of how women had to deal with sexual harassment / sexual assault back then was no sell it, because you don't want to kick up any dirt. You don't want to, stir the pot basically. So no sell it, which means don't talk about it.
Yeah. There's twice during this episode where Terry Runnels mentions that it was that incident. And also later on when her ex-husband, Dustin Runnels, Dustin Rhodes, grabbed the comm inside the plane and started singing a song about heartbreak.
Yeah.
And she went to go talk to him, and tell him, hey, just stop. And it was, I think she said, Paul Heyman just told her, no sell it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It ended up being a JR who went and talked to him.
And then Dustin in turn was the guy who pulled Ric Flair away from Heidi when he was exposing himself to her and putting her hand on his thing. So she was like, you know what, the singing was terrible and I wanted my microphone back, but I sort of gave him a little bit of a pass because he was the only guy on that plane to do something about that. There was the Scott, sort of one of the interesting things was the repercussions afterwards. So
yes.
Kurt Hennig was fired, and Kyoto had said, he kind of figured that when the heat would die down, he would come back around. But of course, Kurt Hennig passed away.
Yeah.
Fairly soon after this. I mean, it was within the year, I think, that he passed away. Scott Hall, who evidently was just like complete, like he claims that he was slipped a halcyon in his drink. He had a really gnarly interaction with Heidi as well, where he grabbed her, ripped her shirt, and licked her, apparently. And then that was her breaking point. She was like, I just went back to the galley and didn't move. And people were mad at me because I wasn't giving them food or drink. And I didn't care. And I was like, I was applauding that. I was like, man, your breaking point, I really wish it was a lot sooner. Like, just, hey, it's out of control. And so Scott Hall got fired, but I wonder if that was like, because they had mentioned like Justin Credible had mentioned that Scott Hall was basically passed out the vast majority of the time.
They thought he was dead.
He might have died. And so they put him in a wheelchair, and JR, for whatever reason, seemed to be mad about that, and was giving Justin Credible some static about it. He was like, look, I'm just trying to help out here.
Yeah.
And so,
what is Justin Credible supposed to do? Just leave Scott Hall on the plane?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And, Dustin Rhodes was it fined for?
That's how it was put. Because JR was talking about how he had an option of whether to let him go or fine him. Mm-hmm. And JR said, well, I thought Dustin learned the lesson through all this. But then I think he said he was just fine, but for some reason it's in my head that he actually, let me double check, because I thought he was one of the people that got let go after this too.
Yeah, because seemingly his biggest transgression, according to JR, was using the behind the seat, the little flap that you put magazines in. He was using that for his spittoon for whatever, because he chews tobacco and he was spitting in that. Whatever that's called.
Okay, so they allowed Dustin's contract to expire in December of 2003, so he wasn't let go.
Okay. But seemingly, I think JR mentioned that he was suspended, so there was some repercussions there. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, he's asked, why did Ric Flair get a pass? And you could just see the look on JR's face and how he's like trying to diplomatically answer this question. And he says, well, that's a good question. You could say that he was a made man at a high level, so he got a pass. And, JR obviously understood how wrong that is. But it's interesting because you sort of juxtapose that with what Ric Flair has said, for example, on the Broken Skull sessions, that, around that time, his confidence was completely shot, or during the span of his career. Anyway, this was 2002. This is pretty soon after he came back. And I forget which period of time he felt that he had lost his confidence completely. I mean, Ric Flair is a fairly complicated individual as well. But I mean, that it's interesting to me that Ric Flair had all these insecurities, but seemingly he was like untouchable. Like, they wouldn't punish him even if he did do this stuff. But yeah, so the most heartbreaking stuff was after this when Heidi was talking about the aftermath, and she went right out there. They were starting to clean up, but then they found some syringes and they were like, we're not doing this.
Blood, all sorts of stuff.
And then
they're like, we're not doing that.
The captain was like, no, you guys need to clean up. And she was like, I heard him say that as I was leaving the plane,
Yeah.
And then she goes home, and it's the saddest thing because she talks about, what do I tell my husband? We want to keep this quiet. And, are there going to be questions from her own husband as to, well, what did you do to elicit that? And that's heartbreaking. Mm-hmm. That's because your spouse is supposed to be the person who protects you, who does everything they can to say, hey, what do you need? And what do we do to make it better with you? Not, well, why did you do this? And unfortunately, I think in too many relationships, that's the case. And that was heartbreaking to hear. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. She talks about there was another girl on the flight who did file a lawsuit, and that's where the settlement came from. And that's when Tommy Dreamer said the absolute asinine comment of, well, she took the money. If she was so important, she should have gone to the law enforcement. Which at that point, I was like, fuck that guy.
Yeah.
RVD has a good point about, maybe it's not a great idea sometimes to meet your heroes, because he refers to it as freaks, but you can kind of tell. He says a lot of these people are freaks, but you can tell he has a heavier intonation when he says that, I feel like that was a euphemism for some of them are shitty people.
Yeah.
So don't.
That's an adage that's been around for a long time. Don't meet your heroes.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah.
Because they're bound to let you down. You know.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is you admire somebody for something they do or they've done, and you don't know the full person.
Yeah.
And when you learn who the full person is, there's a chance you'll be disappointed, greatly disappointed.
For sure. Yeah. So yeah, I'm glad they let Heidi get the last word.
Me too.
Because they did. And, seemingly they did this in maybe 2 interviews. And I wonder if, again, good question to ask the filmmakers, was she interviewed along in a batch with with the wrestlers, and then maybe when they saw what they had, went back and gave her the last word. That's a smart move. That's such a great move to allow her to have the final say.
I know, because like we said at the beginning of the show, for so long, this story had been told through the perspective of the wrestlers.
Yeah, right.
And you're getting just one perspective of it, and when you bring her into the story and get her perspective as well, you get the fuller picture of what happened.
Mm-hmm, yeah. At this point, has Ric Flair said anything about this?
Not that I'm aware of. No.
I thought I saw something where but I looked at his social media and I looked at his Twitter and I looked at his Instagram, and I didn't see a
statement or anything like that.
I didn't see a statement or anything like that. I mean, I don't know if he's got, publicists or whatever that would.
Yeah, I'm sure he's got at least a manager.
I mean, I'm looking at his, yeah, it's funny. You always go and look at the last tweet, if it's regarding this or not. And it's just like a picture of him and Undertaker. And it's like got 100, a ton of replies here. Just people just, saying, man, I'm so disappointed in you, et cetera, et cetera. So no, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see, the further fallout of this. I mean, there had been some speculation that maybe Ric Flair would be brought into
AEW. I know.
Yeah, and I wonder if that is going to play into this. Who knows what future awaits Tommy Dreamer. I don't know. I mean, even I really doubt that anything would happen with Brock Lesnar. But yeah, I guess you never know. I mean, he's got now a scheduled match with Roman Reigns at the Saudi Arabia show. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, something that happened 20 years ago was but a mere blip. Him exposing himself to Terry Runnels is seemingly the tip of the iceberg in terms of other behavior in this episode from other wrestlers. So something that might usually blow up would just be another, just sort of buried in the rest of it.
There's a lot of, as you mentioned, little bits of mentions of behavior by other wrestlers that, it seemed like it has their own troubling stories potentially behind it. I
mean, even RVD sort of throwing out as a side note, sometimes, wrestlers would slip local girls, drugs and have their way with them is a horrifying statement unto itself.
It is.
And I mean, look, we all understand that wrestling back then, especially for whatever reason, drew a certain element, like when Undertaker fondly remembers, and I know this is somewhat out of context, back in the day, guys would have drugs and guns in their duffel bags. We've heard stories like, even Stevie Ray talking about, well, I went out to my car and grabbed a gun and almost shot Vader because he shot on a guy during a Battle Bowl match. Mm-hmm. That rough element back then came with that came just a lot of behavior that on one hand, it's easy to look at as, oh man, they used to carry, they did a lot of drugs and a lot of guns. There's another element that's a lot bleaker than that, than self-harm. Because you think of drugs sometimes as just, it's self-harm. That guy ended up dying younger than he probably should have because his heart exploded because he had too many drugs.
Yeah.
But there was probably a lot of collateral damage along the way that is similar to what we saw in this episode.
Yeah.
So I mean, and you know, I think probably the best illustration of it is in the Grizzly Smith episode, you know, which we stayed away from just because it's like, I think you and I both, because there was so little actual sort of wrestling context in that episode, I didn't feel personally equipped to really talk about that subject.
Yeah, same,
you know, that because there was a lot going on there, and not a lot of it had to do with wrestling. And I don't feel equipped to talk about that stuff. I just don't, you know.
Yeah.
So anyways, do we know what's up next?
Let me check.
Because I did not.
I did not look either.
What was up next? I mean, this season looks like it's going to have plenty of. You know, I'm really looking forward to watching the FMW episode.
They ran. I don't know if it's next. They did run a teaser for the Canyon episode, so maybe that's the next one. Yes, it is.
I think I have seen. Okay, that'll be interesting.
Chris Canyon one's next. Yeah,
that'll be interesting. He was a hell of a character. So yeah, that, you know, we'll be talking about that next week. Let us know what you guys think about all this in the comments below. It's a heavy episode.
It is.
And yeah, I'm very interested. Hopefully, Jason and Evan would come back on the show and talk about this.
Yeah,
you know, this season, I know it's going to be a load of. We'll see. Hey, can you guys stick around for an extra hour or so?
Did you watch? Have you watched the season 3 preview they did?
No. I've only seen like the little trailer for season 3.
I'd recommend checking it out because it's not like it's huge on spoilers per se, but they give their perspective on some of the upcoming episodes, and it's interesting stuff. So I'd recommend checking it out.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, definitely. I will. Absolutely. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We appreciate it. Till next time. We'll talk to you later.
Goodbye.